Hello and welcome to the Sustainable Materials Management webinar series, a joint effort between the National Recycling Coalition and the Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center. My name is Wayne Bowen. I'm the program manager for the Recycling Market Center and will serve as your moderator today. The focus of today's webinar topic is surviving recycling's historic markets downturn, near and longer term strategies. Our presenter today is Dr. Lisa Skumatz, who I will introduce in a moment. Following her presentation, we will conduct a question and answer session. If you have a question or comment, please use the Q&A feature box located on your control panel on your screen. You may also use the chat feature to request assistance if you're experiencing technical difficulties during the webinar. Please note that an edited version of this webinar will be made available for viewing via YouTube links on the National Recycling Coalition and PA Recycling Market Center websites. And now I'd like to introduce our presenter. Dr. Skumatz is an economist and principal of Skumatz Economic Research Associates, also known as SARA. Her bio is long and impressive, so I'm not going to read it in its entirety, but I'm just going to hit some highlights, and we'll let her provide some more information about her company and the work in the presentation. Dr. Skumatz has a nationwide reputation in integrated planning, program evaluation, rates and revenue options, economic and policy analysis, outreach, engagement, and scenario analysis forecasting work conducted for solid waste clients at the local, county, state, and national level. Dr. Skumatz has taught solid waste integrated planning and evaluation workshops in the US, the UK, and elsewhere. She's a published author, has more than 150 articles in the solid waste field, and is a member of numerous national, state, local, and civic, environmental, professional, economic, and waste management and recycling organizations, including the National Recycling Coalition. And she's also served on the board of directors of many of them. She's worked for a city solid waste utility and has also served as an elected official in Colorado. So right now I'm going to turn the program over to Dr. Lisa Skumatz.
Thank you so much, Wayne. So if you can go to the title slide, that would be great. I'm going to be talking about contamination, and I'm going to be talking about global problems and local solutions. And the slide, I am an economist, and that will come through from some of the talks, some of the information I'll be providing. And that's where the issue about Greshams Law comes in, and I think you'll find it helpful in understanding what's been going on. I hope the volume is okay. Wayne, any last comments about volume?
No, that sounds good.
Perfect. Then go ahead 2 slides. People saw the next slide, and you can go to the next slide. So the things that I want to make sure are understood are some upfront definitions. And I think most of us can agree that collection of recycling is not recycling. Diversion is not recycling. Next slide. And providing 20% trash and 80% recycling in a commodity is not recycling. And I'm going to posit that single stream is not the devil, that in fact MRFs today can clean single stream to the specifications that may be required, but certain things about what we've been providing, what the market is demanding, what we've got for incentives in the market has made that not happen. Next slide. So from an economist point of view and from a market point of view, recycling should and does, and from a circular economy point of view as well, recycling does and should involve the use of that commodity as a resource, as an input to production, production of products and so on. That is sort of the economic definition of a commodity. And the definitions of materials that are developed by ISRI or mills or whatever are really vital for defining what that commodity is, what that economic input of production is. And I think what's been the problem is that, for the U.S. and outside the U.S., what we've been providing currently isn't what we've been providing, what we've been collecting really isn't that commodity or input of production. Next slide. In fact, we've got some significant issues with quality and contamination. And what I want to make especially clear is that this problem is not new. It well predates the single stream era. But it has certainly been worsening and accelerating in tandem with single stream. But the mills have been complaining not just for years, but actually for decades about the quality of material that they've been provided. Materials recovery facilities, or MRFs, can sort close to specs now, but not with the current incentives, not with the current input streams. The 4 or 5 key things that are necessary to get MRFs to be able to provide material to SPAC is management attention, processing speed and depth, adding steps, meaning adding equipment, adding optical sorters or whatnot, and also the input quality is a key part of that as well. I think what's happened is that no MRFs were really spec'd for 20% trash input. And we've seen reports of contamination levels for input streams 20, 25, 30%. And one article said that a community in California had 40% inbound contamination. That's pretty impossible for a traditionally designed MRF to really make any kind of quality coming out. And while industry standard outbound was 33% for many years, I think it's also been many, many years since that has been enforced in any way. And enforced quality is what drives what is delivered, whether that's single stream source, dual stream source, or whatever. If a quality level is not enforced, then what is delivered is up for grabs. And so China really brought a long-standing problem to a head. Nationally or internationally, what we have been producing is not an economic input. And how can we fix that problem? And what is the result? Next slide. So our research has found a number of different options that have been tried around the US and internationally for trying to meet or get to a definition of a real commodity, getting to something that's clean or cleanish towards a commodity. And I'm talking about each one of these in turn, so we'll be on this slide for a while. One of the first one we might consider, and I think that people's gut reaction is, what about dual stream? What if we just go back to dual stream? Can't we just do that? Well, there are a number of issues related to that. First is the fact that I know of, for instance, a dual stream facility that was built fairly recently. And that dual stream facility was really concerned about the quality coming out, and they wanted to make sure that, you know, that with dual stream, they could get a really strong quality out. But what they found is, you know, they built it to that standard, but all 3 haulers that are operating in that MRF's territory are bringing their materials to a MRF that is 45 miles away, because that MRF accepts single stream material, and that's what those 3 haulers' customers want, expect, and really like for their recycling program. So that MRF is currently operating at significantly under capacity. I have no idea if or how it will survive. The market has really moved on towards single stream collection. Another item is recognize that while recycling may, you know, wish to stay at dual stream, the collection of trash continues to become more and more efficient. Technology changes and other things are always trying to get more for the same price, get more efficient in the collection of trash. If trash collection becomes cheaper and recycling collection and whatnot stays the same or becomes more expensive because you've gone back to dual stream, then the price difference or the cost difference between recycling and trash becomes greater and greater. It looks like a greater and greater subsidy to provide that embedded, you know, recycling service, and it looks more and more like a subsidy, and those programs may be canceled or deleted because of that perceived bigger and bigger subsidy. If one section of the system evolves, the other section has to continue to evolve too, and there's no doubt about the fact that moving to single stream collection dramatically decreased the cost of single stream recycling collection. So that is something that's also really an element in this whole picture. Another possibility is, what about glass? Let's say if glass is the perceived big problem, can we split what we do with glass? A really smart community in Colorado looked at the issue and said, what can we, you know, should we go to single stream? Should we try the single stream modified? Should we have an insert? What should we do? And so what they ended up doing was looking at 8 different scenarios and ultimately elected to say, to provide information to their customers and say, you know, customers, you can put your glass in the single stream container that we're going to provide you, but it would be even better if you brought that glass to the very convenient drop-offs that we have all around the community. And those drop-offs are color sorted and so on and so forth. And you should know that a much, much larger percent of the material that goes to the drop-offs gets recycled, and a very small percent of what you put into the single stream bin of that glass gets recycled and makes it to market. And that education lets them retain customers, but let them, the customers who really wouldn't go to the drop-offs could still provide that material and feel like they were providing good service and that some of that glass did make it to market. But they're still retaining a lot of really good quality glass because of that attention to those drop-offs. So you could split how you handle glass, and that could be another way to handle it. Another thing you do for glass, and we'll talk about that a little bit more potentially later, is you could also address some of the glass issue by having a container deposit law, and that tends to take clean material into a clean stream. I should say that one of the benefits of that split glass issue is that people were still able to put things in that single stream container, but way less of it made it into that single stream container. It went into the drop-offs instead, and so there was less glass in that container to contaminate other items that were collected in that single stream container. So kind of a nice all-around solution. The third item, the yellow one there, is bag fees or bag bans. Plastic bags are a problem not just because people, they aren't in many cases recyclable, but the issue of them jamming up the collection, the MRF processing. And that MRF processing, it needs to be as efficient as you can and not have as much downtime, because anything that you do that increases the cost of that processing is something that makes the system less efficient, makes it difficult to get the material clean, and so on and so on. Another item that you can do is delete materials. You could just say, okay, we're not going to take glass anymore. But I want to argue that it's really important that you not just look at how a MRF operates in terms of one material, because the belts, the screens, every step of that process is shared by multiple materials. If you look at it as a one-off program or product decision or one-off material decision, you may be increasing the cost essentially for some of the other materials that are profitable and decreasing their profit because you're not sharing the cost of shared elements of that processing plant among all the materials and all the tonnages that could be going through. So it's not just something that says, here's our problem material, let's delete it. That may in fact not be the best way to make that decision. So an integrated decision is what's really important. Another thing you do is some voluntary standards. You could say, let's all get together and let's all say, we're going to have a similar kind of collection system so we can have this universal education program. And let's all decide that our materials should be inbound at this cleanliness, outbound at this cleanliness, and we'll take these steps, and we think these are the steps that are necessary to provide it all. And you need to have all the stakeholders involved, the stakeholders that are the government, the haulers, the MRF operators, and so on and so forth. And that kind of a voluntary system can be effective for a little while. But unless there are economic signals in place to help reinforce that behavior, any single of those actors that finds it beneficial at some point in time to leave that system and operate on their own in some other system, in some other way, will bring that voluntary standard, that voluntary system to a halt. And I think that that's been a really difficult problem with voluntary standards. The next item is contracts. And contracts really involve three kinds of contracts. Those contracts can be contracts that mean establishing a contract for collection to make the collection system as cost effective as possible, reaching economies of scale, not duplicating going down the same streets, and so on. That is something that can potentially, depending on the size of the community, the number of haulers operating in the area, and so on, the more cost effective you can make the collection, the collection part of the system, the more, say, money or cost you can incur in the processing and still have the overall cost of the system be the same, and yet maybe make a cleaner material coming out. Being as efficient as possible at the delivery of the program is one other part that can be established potentially through a contract, not necessarily recommending contracts, just noting that the more efficient, more cost effective that the program can be, that means the more that could potentially be spent on processing and yet retain the same system cost overall. Another type of contract is between a MRF and an end user. So you may set up a contract between your MRF and, let's say, a specific mill in a neighboring state or in your state. And you may produce exactly the kind of material you may make an agreement with that end user to provide exactly the kind of material that they need and that's a very beneficial arrangement from both points of view. And so that's another type of contract that can help make getting to clean or getting to the cleaner material and the right material into a market, into an input to processing. And that's something that makes a lot of sense as well. The third type of contract is the one I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And that one is one between a community and a MRF, looking at what kind of cleanliness is going to be required coming in, what are we going to do for requirements out, what are the price incentives and so on going to be, who's responsible for what, and so on. I'll talk about that contract in a little bit in a moment. What other things can we do to try to deal with the situation? And one is local market development. So if you don't need to go to a major market, and if you can produce materials that are clean for a local market, that's another possible way to address the situation. And there are some states, some counties, and others who have been quite aggressive about recruiting local users for the materials that the local recycling community is producing. So those kinds of activities, and there are some states out there with some very aggressive and interesting programs. I think if you look on NRC's website, you'll see some summaries of some of those very aggressive states. Pennsylvania, and the group we're talking with right now, has been a very active state for doing exactly that kind of thing, as has South Carolina, Minnesota, and a number of other states. They have very remarkably good programs. Another system that you can consider is a system of rejects and fines. So in that case, what we're talking about is, for instance, in another country, they went ahead and they said, okay, we the federal agency are going to mandate that the local communities need to provide materials that are cleaner. We think markets are important and you should provide materials that are cleaner, and we're going to fine you if you don't do that. The problem with the system they put in that particular case was that the local communities didn't always have direct control over the MRFs who were doing the processing. And the MRFs have a tremendous amount of control in this situation. Whatever comes in, they process to provide whatever they can get sold at the tail end. And so if you don't have direct control, direct ownership, or something on that, then putting a penalty on an agency that does not have that control is a really big problem. Now, China has come in and done rejects and fines for us on a very big and very wholesale, wide basis. That system can work very well when you are the buyer, you are the entity that has control over the product that you will or will not buy. So that they, in a sense, put in that rejects and fines system for us. The last one listed here is education. And education is something that can be very valuable. It's a lot easier to clean a stream that's clean than one that's very dirty. I will say that there are some unintended consequences that can arise, however. In a market like we've had for the last decades, if a community got together an education program that said, let's get a clean stream in, or or when in doubt, throw it out, that sort of thing. In a situation where the commodity that's coming out of the MRF is not enforced, and it goes and a dirty bale is accepted the same as a clean bale, then essentially what that education program under that situation would be doing is actually adding profit to the MRF. Because if they bring in new, cleaner material, then the MRF could presumably skip a step, or speed up the processing, or other things that get the same quality of bale out the tail end and get the same price. So in a sense, you've allowed them to skip a step, become more efficient, and make more money at the MRF, which may not have been your intended consequence. In fact, until that bale is enforced at the tail end, it's something that there is every incentive to produce the quality of bale that's checked out at the tail end. The last thing, of course, that's at the bottom of the slide is that every MRF pretties the bales, and that's something that tries to make it look cleaner, but in fact is not really a cleaner thing. And why do these things, these strategies, why are they not really working, or why have they not been working in the near term, or what has been the really big problem? Why can't we get to clean? And this is the next slide, please. And it's because of a basic economic principle, and that economic principle is called Gresham's Law. Gresham's Law really talks about good money, or bad money drives out good money. And it's like having a situation where you have a coin that's accepted, that's a $10 tin, T-I-N, dollar coin versus a gold coin, and they're both accepted as a dollar. Well, what you'll find is that in any reasonable situation, those, if they're accepted the same and so on, that the tin is what's going to flood the market and people are going to hoard the gold. In this case, we're talking about bad bales drive out good bales. Bad bale, if you're not enforcing quality control, if there's no reward for quality or a better price for a cleaner bale, then it's a race to the bottom. Everybody will produce. The highest profit thing to do is to produce the quality of bale that will make it into the market, will get sold. That's the lowest quality bale that will not be rejected. And that is what we've been facing for years now, with no enforcement of quality and no reward for quality. That is there is an impossible trend to stop. And it did not start with single stream. It began the first time an out-of-spec bale was not rejected by a mill or an end user. The minute that happened and the minute no quality control happened on those bales in a significant way, it was a race to the bottom for quality, and the market has no recourse on that. It's irreversible as long as they are not regularly rejected. Well, regularly rejected is what China did for us, or to us, you take your pick, and enforcement of a commodity is an absolute key to a well-functioning market. Next slide. For those who will care about how it's actually, when you get those who care how it's actually phrased in economics will care about this slide, but I'm going to go on past this slide about Greshams Law. Next slide says, to me, there have been rational actors and irrational actors in this market over the last decades. And the rational actors have been the MRFs. And I'm not a MRF shill. I don't, work with for the benefit of MRFs or anything else. I'm just an economist and researcher and consultant who tries to figure out, how do we make our systems work better? How do we get the best recycling programs we can get? How do we make things work well at the city, county, state, whatever level? And for the last decades, the MRFs have been acting very rationally. If they get no dollar reward to slow down the processing, if they get no dollar reward from a cleaner bale, if there's no one checking or rejecting the bale, then it is a race to the bottom. What can I get away with in quality? That is what I'm going to produce, because if I have shareholders, if I have people who own my facility, if I do anything else, if I make cleaner than the minimum accepted, then they should actually be firing me, because that is not maximizing profit. That is not, what the market incentives, the economic incentives tell me to do. And anybody who does differently is actually, their shareholders should probably fire them, because they're not doing the job that the sort of market, the investors, et cetera, would want them to be doing. And if you do something out of the goodness of your heart too long and it ends up hurting profits, that's something that is not sort of well rewarded within the marketplace. The irrational actors in my thinking have been the mills who will install pre-cleaning equipment in their facilities because the bales that are arriving are too dirty. They put in equipment, they put in labor for pre-cleaning that material, but they do not take that money instead and use it to pay a higher price for a cleaner bale. So instead, they will incur costs and not take that very same money. We're not talking about new money, but they do not take that same money that went into pre-cleaning equipment and pre-cleaning labor and give it to the MRFs who are actually set up to clean material, and instead take that exact same money, no new money, and pay for clean bales. That is irrational behavior in my mind, and to just complain about bad material and not set up the system that says, I like your material always comes cleaner, or I will pay anybody who will get me material that is clean to this spec, and I will reject anybody who doesn't. That would be rational behavior. Complaining and not paying for the quality you wish for or you desire is not very rational behavior, and it has exacerbated the problem. Next slide, please. So where do we sort of fall on which of these things make sense for communities to be looking at? I would argue that looking at only dual stream is not really feasible in this day and age. That households are unwilling to go back, and the horse is pretty much out of the barn on that. Including glass, I think it's definitely worth considering. I think that if it's possible in your area, it's something that may make quite a lot of sense for your community, and it might be worth moving. Bag fees, bag bans, I think that's a definite consider and do. There's, getting people insist on bagging their recyclables. People insist on, putting plastic bags in because they think they're recyclable or wish they were recyclable. A bag or a ban or a fee on that can help address a lot of that problem, cleaning up the stream in the process of also making less downtime at the MRFs. Deleting materials, again, I think that's something that's a broader decision than just reactively saying this material bad, this material good. You really need to look at what leads to the profits and the market prices and so on, and the net profit from individual materials at a MRF. And it's a more complicated decision than just good material, bad material. I would say voluntary standards from an economist's point of view, they might work for a little bit of time, but in a long time system, they're not going to be very effective. The incentives are just not there. The enforcement is just not feasible, and it's not something that works very well. I would say contracts, and each of the three contract types that I mentioned all are worth considering and or doing, and looking at whether or not they make sense for your community. I will again talk about contracts between communities and MRFs in a sec. Local market development, I have a question mark there because it would be great, but it takes a lot of the right things to come together to make it be successful. One of the key things you need is some really great staff in that agency. You need some really great support by whoever that agent, whether that agency is at state level or the county level. You need strong support from the elected officials or those setting those budgets, and you need to be able to have, say, great reporting to them, and you need to have a time frame that's longer than next week. It's something that takes a lot of time. But in the long run, it is a very valuable and very viable solution. Rejects and fines. China has done that for us, so I don't even have a consider, do, or whatever. It is in place. But I think the U.S. needs to do it for things sold in and by the U.S. as well, because our facilities, our process improvement, our end users can only benefit from having cleaner materials and having the right incentives be in the marketplace, having it be so that cleaner materials is more valuable, worth more, and sells more than materials that isn't clean. Now, under a system where there are rejects and fines, where there are systems where you cannot sell the worst quality bale anymore, then the education thing works very well. The cleaner the material you can put in, that helps get us all to that quality that we're looking for at the end product. And people will always treat the bales. Next slide. One of the things that's really been a problem is that there have been uncertainties and changes in costs and so on over the last couple of years that have really led to dramatic shifts and problems within the marketplace. With China rejects, there have been more and more examples of contracts and restructurings at renewals with really big increases in the prices, the fees, the payments for service, the thresholds of quality, and so on, where cities say, oh my gosh, over the last year they increased my tip fee by $21, and they're going to do it $5 more in a week or 2 weeks or a month or whatever. Increases on the order of $2 to $11 a household a year, which can be a dramatic increase to the cost of recycling at the household level. We've seen dramatic, really high amounts for inbound contamination amounts, and MRFs with contamination at 40% in some cases. This is really untenable. The contracts and recommendations and calculations have varied depending on whether it's who it's owned by, the operating arrangements, the responsible parties, and so on. But what's really important here is that, and also, things like the materials allowed and the evolving ton all have made changes in the calculations also over time. But the really important, I worked for a city solid waste utility for a number of years, and I was an elected official for another 10 years overseeing some of the trash and recycling systems. And one of the things that, from a community standpoint, they cannot tolerate is changes within a budget cycle. Unexpected changes in a budget cycle are just a really big problem for a community. Actually, as long as, they can almost tolerate a little bit higher price if they don't have that unpredictability. And that is a perfect situation for a mutual agreement and a contract. Next slide. What we've seen, in the near term, next slide. Some of the best near-term strategies would be education for inbound contamination and contracts and incentives for outbound quality. Contracts can help you allocate and balance financial risk and help get you to marketable materials. Okay, next slide. So near-term strategies, number one would be a bag fee now, and even with a bag fee or bag ban, with the bag fee, you can get 80% reduction in the of bag use with just a simple small nickel fee even. Another near-term thing that can happen is splitting glass, as I mentioned, and potentially a bottle bill. Next slide. Another local near-term thing you can do is worry about if you can reduce the cost or optimize the cost of the current program, then that can make it so that the system is, you have a little bit of money freed up to make the cleaning part more expensive or slower or whatever, and still end up at the end with a bale that can be can meet standard and be sold at a price that makes sense. So some of the things, just as reminders for how do you make your programs more efficient? Well, recycling collection every week is, based on the statistical work and the cost work that we've been doing, is not a very optimal system. Collecting recyclables weekly gets you maybe 1 to 3 additional percentage points, but you pay almost twice as much for that system. Those extra 1 to 3 percentage points of tons are about 5 times as expensive as the tons you collected from that first collection every other week. One really straightforward way to get to more efficient collection. Bans and mandates are another really great way to get more for less cost. So you can control the costs on the collection and the program side of things by putting in bans, mandates, requirements, and so on. Pay-as-you-throw through an ordinance or through your particular system is another way to get more material and reduce the cost per ton. And that's really another very good way to try to make a system most cost effective and therefore make it so that those tons are collected in a cheaper way that allows for more investment on the cleaning side. And then, as I mentioned, organized collection can help, and that's something that can be considered in your local community. The next thing.
Oops.
This is, the next slide. Go ahead. That's it. So the graph is what I'm looking for. Thanks. That graph is the analysis by which we say, what are those things that can win in producing a more cost-effective system? That's the thing that tells me, gee, putting in pay-as-you-throw leads to a big increase in tons at a low cost. Going to every other week collection of recyclables is a very cost-effective thing. Bans and mandates deliver a lot of tons at a low cost. So this is not research I'm saying just off the top of my head, but it's actually based on information that we analyzed from hundreds of communities and hundreds of best practices out there. Next slide. The other thing that you want to try to do to get your collection to be as effective and cost-effective as possible is minimize the number of stops in order to deliver the systems that you need. So that's one of the reasons for going to every other week collection of recyclables, because every other week of collection of recyclables lets you free up that other collection for potentially picking up organics or simply saving the cost of that collection and being able to use that cost for the next step of the system. So integrated collection systems and looking at how do you get the most from the least number of stops, which are the major cost of the system, is a really valuable analysis to undertake. Next slide. And things like not splitting collections, doing integrated collection or franchising or so on can also be something that saves the system money, being more efficient at the collection, and looking at, as I mentioned, optimizing the number of stops. Next slide. The next thing, as I mentioned, you can do, again, is consider the accepted inbound. And that's it. It's not something that you can decide based on a national situation. It depends on your local MRF, your local materials, and so on. And again, it's an integrated and complicated decision. Next slide. Inbound and this MRF optimization, the models that we've done show that just pulling out one material can have unintended effects on the profitability of other materials that share that same equipment or labor. Next slide. Another thing, as I mentioned, inbound education, but not the same old education. You know, if you're trying to get to from 20% inbound to something that's cleaner, it's really important to look at education that's not just information, but is also motivational and provides people, you know, and addresses barriers for them. So education that focuses on a few key messages, we tend to focus on 3 things. The next slide. Things we focus on are self-efficacy, saying that, you know, getting people to recognize that their behavior makes a difference regardless of what everybody else does, making it something that they realize they are important. Another thing is sell to their values. There are so many communities that say we should recycle because of the circular economy or because of greenhouse gas or things that may or may not resonate with their local community. And it's important that we not sell to our own professionals, but we push, we make those programs valuable to the people who we really want to use them. That may not just mean the Ira Glasses and the Greenies of the world, but rather that next group and that next group that may in fact not be a big, strong believer in the greenhouse gas issue or anything else. It's very important to do the market research to make sure we're selling to them on their value. Tide in the upper right-hand corner does not say buy Tide because it helps make us lots and lots of money, but that's no doubt why Procter & Gamble wants you to buy it. That is not how they sell it. They did market research to figure out that people want whiter whites and softer, fluffier whatevers. That's what they sell it on. We need to sell recycling on what people value from recycling, not what we value from recycling. And finally, social marketing not social media, but social marketing is really important because it helps focus on motivations and barriers. It makes for new norms. But some of the things I think are really important about it is you have to recognize who is the most trusted messenger among the people who might provide your message. So it might not be people that are perceived to receive benefits or profits or whatever from the program. So it's really important to look at that. When we're looking at that outreach, don't forget to look at how long is that outreach going to last so that we can figure out what is the cost effectiveness of that outreach and how do we make it so that it's the best retained messaging we can possibly do. Really important to education programs, not just to throw it out there, but to throw it out there, have a measurable effect, and have it have a lasting effect so it can be cost effective and potentially as cost effective as some of the other programs that we would be choosing how to spend the money between. Next slide. The last thing to look at is the outbound, and that's especially where contracts and incentives are really vital in terms of figuring out how do we make for a contract that gets us to the quality that we want as the output product. And that means one side could be contracts direct to end users and partners, but we're also talking about the MRF side where we're looking at partners, bounding risks, and so on. Next slide. Next. So I've alluded to this before. There are contracts for collection efficiencies, as I mentioned, in collection. There are contracts directly with end users, but then there are contracts and incentives for in and outbound materials, and that's the one with the contract between the community and the MRF. We've seen more and more examples of those contracts over the last couple of years. We've been doing a lot of surveys to figure out who's got those contracts, how are they changing, what are some examples, and there have been dramatic increases and changes in the amount that people are paying and charging and so on. Those changes are in thresholds, in fees, in payments for service, in inflation factors, in penalties, and so on and so on. The contract recommendations and computations really vary depending on who owns the MRF, what the owner and operating agreement is, who are the responsible parties, what materials are allowed or agreed, and so on and so forth. And as I mentioned before, communities may not need the very lowest cost, but what they need is they need to minimize unexpected changes in those costs in order to provide programs to their residents in a way that makes it so that they can have it in a budgeting cycle and so on. So for the next slide, we see examples of what we've seen is elements that vary all over the map. We've seen contracts that require that changes that have been things like we'll allow a 10% threshold, but then we're going to charge you $100,000 for 10% more, or we're going to allow, the base processing fees are going to be $60 to $65 or something. But other places where they've been $50 and then they escalate to $81. We've seen extra costs for contamination anywhere from $3.50 a household to more than $5 and often $10 a ton. And we've seen shares of revenues. These are all kinds of the things that can be set in contracts. We've seen sharing of revenues between the city and the MRF be anything from like 50% to 100% to one party or the other. Next slide. Some of the things that will be really important for to be determined and set in MRF contracts are, one, a really vital part of an effective MRF contract going forward is a statistical sort of the inbound material with very clear and statistical properties for those protocols. You need to know what's coming in, and the responsibility for how clean the material is coming in does not reside with the MRF. It resides with those overseeing that program. So that's the responsibility of party, sort of the city or the hauler. We also need to have information on who makes the decisions about what materials will and will not be accepted by the program, and and making sure that there are responsibilities for who's going to educate people on what materials are and are not allowed in that inbound material. Feedback to residents and dashboards so they can see how they're progressing is really important to residents as well. That needs to be ironed out. And then statistical sorts for the outbound material, clear protocols for how that's measured, and then clear penalties for not meeting either the quality required inbound or the quality required outbound, with payments going back and forth to the right entities to make sure that we have a true-up, we have incentives, and so on. And then, of course, periodic contract revision after you look at the costs and so on. And transparency is a win for both sides. You can't have a contract where you think you're going to be able to get something over on the other actor and have that be a successful contract. Both sides need transparency. Both sides need clear incentives. Next slide. So one of the elements is what are the clear goals of the contract, what are the metrics, and transparency, clarity of risks and responsibilities are vital. I mentioned the sorts inbound, the decision process for yes and no materials, and for who's going to be responsible for upgrades and equipment maintenance and so on. Is that, where does that responsibility lie, and how will that be addressed? Next one is who's responsible for education, who's responsible for feedback to residents and the dashboard. The outbound statistical sorts are vital, and then you need to set clearly what are the processing costs, what is going to be allowable escalations, what are going to be the fees for exceeding thresholds in or out, revenue sharing agreements, what percent is going to go to who for the revenues from marketed materials, and of course, as I mentioned, the assessments, the contract revisions, and so on. Next slide. These things often take form of something like this, where you have what the goal for inbound contamination is X to Y percent, and for every X percent more, the city pays the MRF some dollars per ton. The goal for outbound has a penalty involved. The goal for outbound is X percent, and for every X percent that exceeds, the MRF has to pay the city a certain dollar per ton. Processing costs are set at some amount based on the inbound tons, and the revenue share agreement with all positive revenues shared at some point, or all negative revenues as well. The cities need predictability, MRFs need reimbursement for excess costs, and both need incentives and accountability. Next slide. What about the longer term? Here in the longer term, there are a couple of big things. What should we be doing in the bigger picture? If we ruled the world, what would we really, really, really like to see, and what are the benefits that we can get from longer-term strategies? Well, some of the long-term strategies are economic development, a really vital thing to, making everybody whole. Every bit, as the state of Minnesota puts, every bit of processing and value added we can make in the state means jobs in our state, and economic development, both at level and coming up with markets nearby and within the state, are valuable. State policies like pay-as-you-throw, bottle bills, bag fees, EPR, all are things that can be done that really improve the situation as well. If I ruled the world, I would say that one of the big things that's important is if you can get a clean, predictable quality material that you can count on, you can start introducing that material into the Chicago and the other regional boards of trade. Why is that important? One, you can't get it if you don't have a quality material that you know is a known quantity you will be trading. So that trade cannot happen if it's a mystery as to what quality is going to arrive on your doorstep. That's one of the reasons that recyclables are, the kinds of recyclables we're generally talking about, fiber and so on, are not on the boards of trade. What we need is a consistent, reliable product of trade, and the benefits then are that we can trade futures, we can have options and other things that are things that make more stable pricing on the market. More stable pricing, people have been complaining about the unpredictability of recyclable programs because they don't know what market price they're going to get. They see market prices fall over time, then they increase, then they fall, then they increase. If it's on a market like this where there are options, futures, and trading of that type, you mitigate that price volatility. You don't get the high highs, you don't get the low lows in nearly the level that you do if you're set with a situation where everyone's just with the situation we have without formal market. More predictable program costs are the outcome of that, and that is, in some cases we mentioned, more important than lowest cost in many cases. Most important of all, if we ruled the world, we recyclers should all wish for a carbon tax or cap and trade legislation on carbon. Why is that? Because the embedded energy in recyclables that virgin materials would have to pay is so high that the price for virgin would nearly always be higher than the price for recyclables. Recyclables would be the preferred commodity in all cases, and that would help increase demand and make it so that the prices can cover the cost of real, true processing to a good quality material. It solves a number of our fundamental problems, and just back of the envelope calculations we've done show that depending on the material, we would be adding $160 to $1,000 per ton for that embedded energy. You look at the amount of embedded energy in aluminum and copper and so on in the graph in the upper right, and you see that there's a tremendous amount of energy that goes into that. Energy translates pretty directly right to carbon, and if carbon is taxed at a certain amount per ton, then that means that's a price benefit for recyclables on a very dramatic level. The other thing that's up in the right-hand corner is a graph that shows NRC, and NRC, along with the original, what was called the Recycling Partnership, not the Recycling Partnership that exists now, but that original titled Recycling Partnership, did have fibers on the Chicago Board of Trade for a short period, 4 years in the 1990s. But there were a number of reasons why that didn't continue, but that kind of inkling was understood that was a right and vital way to get recycling to be a commodity, to be a market-traded commodity that would then be something that's a sophisticated market with the benefits of that sophisticated system. Next slide. There is certainly more detail that I can provide, next slide, on sort of boards of trade, on markets, and so on. But I fit most of that into what I was talking about just a moment ago. But what's important out of markets is that you get program costs that can be more predictable with less price variation, because you can buy materials at a certain cost or sell materials at a certain cost in the future under agreements and known agreements. Next slide. And the carbon tax is really important because of that tremendous embedded energy that it takes. So if you save 95% of the energy for making recycled cans out of existing cans, that is a whole host of greenhouse gases that are not produced. And for those who are trying to make it from virgin materials, a whole host of money that they have to pay in order to get us to the end system. Next slide. So these are the marked energy shares. Next slide. As I mentioned, the nearer term options, we've got some sort of leading directions for what might make most sense on those. For the longer term, on the bottom, some of the things that we think are particularly valuable: new end uses, EPR and bottle bills, commodity market trading enforcement, content standards, carbon tax, which provides a great price advantage, local markets, and of course a number of other things that I'm sure people on the phone are itching to tell everybody on the phone as well. Next slide. Now, China's impact has had an impact on all of us, and at the household level, we do surveys annually to figure out what are people hearing and what are they not hearing. What we found is that between 2018 and 2019, people have started to hear a little bit more about the China and the whole issue about recyclables. But really, it's still 2/3 of the people have not yet heard about China. But that given China, whether or not we should continue to recycle is slipping a little bit as well. People are a little bit concerned about, we should recycle anyway. That's becoming a little bit less, not statistically significant yet, but I'm a little concerned about the drift and support for recycling under the situation we've had with China import restrictions. Next slide. So the takeaways are that China actually gave us time. Between their various named initiatives, they gave us several years and we did nothing. We have since gone to other countries and so on, but we've harmed U.S. manufacturing. The solution is not that rainbow. I'm sorry to say that Econ 101 pretty much always wins in a market, and bad bales will continue to force that is something that is a problem. Enforcement is important to all of us, whether it's China or U.S. We talked about some near-term options that make sense, and some longer-term options that make sense, both moderate longer-term options like market development and so on, but really long-term things like carbon tax and other things that can really solve the problem on a more fundamental level. Definitions of commodity and quality matter, and they have consequences, and we've been abusing that for years. If you can pay higher dollars for a quality that's enforced and understood and recognized, then MRFs can produce clean materials. And enforcing quality in high and low demand times is really important. Consistency of what represents a commodity is absolutely vital to a successful system. Next slide. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to entertain some questions.
Okay, thank you, Lisa, for that great presentation. A lot of information, and so we do have some time for some questions. If you do have a question, just use the Q&A feature on your computer screen. So we do have a couple here already. A couple were posed early in the presentation, so you may have addressed some of these, but I'm gonna list them anyway. This question asks, what are you seeing contract-wise about controlling inbound MRF contamination? How about the levels of non-recyclables being specified?
Do you mean what numbers we're seeing are allowed for inbound?
Yeah, I'd say it sounds like percentage. Yeah.
Yeah, they're still a bit over the map. I'm happy. Why don't I send you back an answer to that question, because we've been looking at some contracts, and we've gathered contracts, and I haven't had a chance to look at a great deal of them. So I'd like to look at some of the newest ones we've been getting and give you a more exact answer to that. So Wayne, I'm happy to send you that, and you can send it out to the group. Okay. Okay,
and I will give you the attendee report, which has the questions on the report, and they're perfect. They go to the person who asked the question, so you may respond that way. This next question has to do with the bale specs. Are you seeing any trend to produce more number 56 SRPN and/or number 58 SCN, and reducing the number 54 mixed paper at MRFs?
Again, can I look at the contract and get that information? That sort of level of detail was a little bit different from what I was expecting to present in today's thing. I did not look over the contracts before I gave this today.
It sounds like it's the 56 and 58 are they higher quality bales, and 54 the mixed paper is the lower quality, I assume. Yep. Okay, next question is, what might we do about e-commerce, flexible plastic or paper envelopes with bubble wrap packaging that are proliferating and are clearly not recyclable in a MRF?
I would argue that that's part of the education process. We just did a project in a town in Colorado, and did some sorts before as pre-sorts. We did we looked at what was contaminating the stream and what people were apparently confused about. our goal was really to make sure that the material was clean when it came out, and so we found that some of the best education was provided with cart hangers, and so we provided really clear material that focused on the things that were problems. Those, those kind of envelopes are an issue. People don't know what to do with shred. People are putting in plastic bags. Whatever your local biggest problem is, it's not hard to figure out what that is. We went ahead and then did some education, and we're in the midst of a survey after the fact, but we looked at a project in another state. In fact, the NRC just gave an award to a community in north central Ohio that with a pre and post education period, they were able to reduce the contamination by 40%, or the OOPS tags by 40%, and the contamination, of course, pretty dramatically as well. I think that is where that getting the clean inbound stream really needs to be in clear education, not big, broad education. Don't tell them to recycle more. They're well aware they should be recycling. Recycling more is in many cases a problem. You need to say is recycling right, and whether that your slogan is when in doubt, throw it out, or whatever. I think a clean stream is achieved through education. It's the best method of doing that.
Okay.
Clean stream in, I should say.
Right. How do you feel about the trend of MRF operators wanting to put all the material market risk on the cities or the program?
I think it's an agreement where you have to figure out who can handle what kind of risk and who can't. If a community can handle that kind of market risk, then a successful contract can be made. I don't know of many communities that can. I think that if the community can't take the risk, and if the MRF refuses to take the risk, then I think there's going to end up a third party in the middle that inserts itself and says, we'll take that risk, but at a price.
How do you think local governments can help develop U.S. markets for the material China used to take?
Well, there are a number of pretty successful recycling market development efforts at the state level and at the county level. But there are also a lot of them that are not very successful at all. I think that, and people are struggling with that right now. I think it's in the long term that, to the extent you can reduce transportation, that's a plus for everybody. To the extent that you can tailor an outbound product for a designated outbound user with a long-term contract, that's a win-win also for people. That stability, that predictability is really valuable. As I mentioned, there are a number of states with successful market development programs. I look to Minnesota, I look to Pennsylvania, I look to South Carolina, I look to a number of others, and as I mentioned, there should be information on NRC's website because of the recycling market development workshops they've been doing around the country. I know we put together some summary materials on leading market development programs at that level. Some of the key features are also mentioned in that, and I tried to mention what some of those were, including support and attention at the, let's say it's a state program, at the legislative level with constant feedback and reinforcement to those legislators that these programs, to the extent that these programs are successful, that they need to be kept up. I've also seen a lot of money and so on go to market development efforts that were less successful, and that's too bad. I think besides the management attention that it takes for the funders and so on, it also takes the right staffing that are really go-getters and provide the level of attention that the locals need. In some cases, that's technical assistance. In some cases, of going to a neighboring state and saying, you know what, we're willing to provide you a better deal if you locate in our state. Can we steal your industry and move you to where we know we have material for you? So it's all kinds of levels, and making sure to measure and justify the efforts that those market development folks are doing in a credible way is really vital to their long-term existence and to their growth as well. But funding is really important. It does not happen for free.
What percentage of states do you see utilizing the key elements of your short-term recommendations?
States, gosh. I mean, mostly I think a lot of these things happen at the local level, not so much the state level, because these are local MRFs, these are local agreements, these are local transfers of materials. So only dual stream. There are a couple states that are pretty much that really like dual stream and have been sticking with dual stream, but I think it's difficult to, as I mentioned, unless there's some kind of state policy or state mandates or something, it's difficult to keep a recycling program going if the cost differential between recycling and trash continues to grow because trash evolves and becomes more and more efficient. So I think it's really important to look at that element of it as well, because in states where there's some question about the quote viability of recycling, making a necessarily high cost collection system is a really visible way of potentially making yourself a problem of continuing the program. I think the split glass one, one example, there are a number of the single stream collection programs out there that are quote modified single stream that collects glass in a little side hopper or so on. And as I mentioned, the one that had split glass as a decision using a two-pronged system where it went to drop-offs or in the combined container. That's a program that's in Colorado, and that's been pretty, I think, a real dramatic system with really great numbers. The bag fees and bag bans, I think that's been a growing thing, and it has so many benefits from litter on up that I think that's a really, I'd say the numbers on that are moderately high, but increasing all the time. And contracts are absolutely, and everybody knows to their scariness or whatever, contracts are certainly growing. And with contract terms that people have been quite unfamiliar with for some time. Education, I think there are a number of agencies that have been focusing on getting to a cleaner stream inbound, and I think this is the right time to be doing that. I think it's vital, and that's certainly something that's been growing a lot. I see that concern and that push very strong now, and thankfully sort of banning generic messages about recycling and recycling is good and recycling greenhouse gas to really practical things that say recycling is great, but we need it to be good quality recycling. So.
That leads into a good next question. NPR recently did a podcast saying that recycling is not environmentally and economically beneficial. What would you say to that as an economist and an expert in recycling?
It was a little murky, the sound on that. So you said NPR had a podcast that said what?
Recycling is not environmentally and economically beneficial.
Oh, well, I think that I don't know how to answer that exactly. I think it's true that it's a far more complicated question than we have been making it. I think we have noted that recycling is we've been pushing for recycling for a long time, and it certainly has greenhouse gas benefits and that sort of thing. But it's true that some research out of Oregon and elsewhere is showing that, as part of a bigger system, there's some recycling maybe that's better than others, but there are certain kinds of environmental things that are even stronger. I think I'm not in a situation to say that the jury is completely decided on that. Life cycle analysis is giving us some lessons that we may not have been expecting to hear, and that may be what NPR was focusing on. I think our industry is part of a situation that's of a system that's far more complicated than we've been making it, and there are simple knee-jerk answers, and then there are the whole system type answers that may not be quite what we expected. I think we're in the midst of some really interesting research right now, but short term, I think recycling is likely better than some recycling, and the right recycling is likely better than not recycling. We've always said, though, that reduction and reuse are better than recycling.
What would you suggest as the best arguments to provide city leaders to encourage continuing recycling over the long term, given the current market challenges?
I think you were saying, how do we make policy and decision makers make it important to them to have it be clean material? I think feedback loops and having dashboards and so on, and not, bringing reports back to the decision makers and the funders to show them that the materials are cleaner and cleaner and cleaner is the best way to do that. I think we've focused on tons, and tons is not really the best indicator perhaps for saying how successful we've been. We put some articles in Resource Recycling and other places suggesting that there are other metrics that may be better, and maybe some of the best metrics are to do periodic sorts of the stream and show and see what remains, so that we know, what we have yet to tackle in the waste stream. I think, though, that dashboards showing that the material is cleaner and cleaner, meets standard, and so on, is and providing that feedback is really important. I think all social marketing suggests that feedback is a really important part of the learning experience and in keeping something successful.
What could EPR do that CRV laws cannot do?
EPR is one of the best approaches to bring responsibilities where responsibilities may lie in a way that provides incentives for the long-term best design of a system. I think that's what it can do that better and better recycling programs cannot quite do.
Has contamination really gotten that much worse, or has the continued decline of the paper percentage in the stream just naturally raised the percent of residuals in the mix?
Oh, that's an interesting question, because if anybody out there has contamination level data that they believe over the last, say, 15 or 20 years to look at and examine that trend over X years, I would love to have that. I think it doesn't really exist, at least not in any kind of way that other than individual companies can actually review. I think the problem has been longstanding. Whether it got dramatically worse in a year or 2 or 5 before China got freaked out, I couldn't say. I think that the materials, again, when the first non-spec bale got accepted, it was an impossible trend to stop. When we stopped enforcing quality in our U.S. mills as well as in international bale sales, it was a trend that was difficult to stop, a race to the bottom, absolutely. I don't know that anyone could say with clarity that that the numbers demonstrate one material over another, or when it got dramatically worse, or so on. If somebody has those numbers, I would love to talk with you about that.
Okay, this attendee just let us know that the Northeast Recycling Council did issue a response to that NPR podcast, and he provided a link. If you could please put that on the chat feature. I don't believe the audience can see this question or this response. If whoever did that, please put that on the chat feature. So thank you for that. Next question is, how do we get public leaders and officials on board with continuous recycling even if costs are rising?
How do we get recycling decision makers? Is that what you said?
Yeah. How do you get the leaders, public officials, and leaders on board, even though the costs are rising, to a point that it might be breaking a budget or so forth?
I think the way to do it is to make it dependable or not volatile. So I think contracts benefit communities as well as they benefit merch and all the actors. I think it makes it so that people understand what the prices are going to be, and then it can be planned for. I think it's unexpected change that makes the system really untenable for a community. I think all it takes is a couple of surveys to show that citizens dramatically want recycling. I don't think I've seen a survey in the last decade that doesn't show that a majority of citizens want recycling. I think that that and predictability are the types of things that make it palatable to a community.
Okay. All right, I think we're just about out of time, so we're gonna wrap it up here. So again, this webinar, like all the webinars in this series, has been recorded and will be made available via YouTube links on both the National Recycling Coalition and Pennsylvania Recycling Market Center websites. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you again, Dr. Skumatz, for the great presentation. We hope you'll join us for next month's webinar, and please visit the NRC and RMC websites for schedule updates. And so have a great day, everybody.
And I'll look up some of the statistics and numbers that people were asking for in the early questions and get those to you, Wayne.
All right, thank you very much.